Welcome back. Thank you for tuning in to College Football with Sam Live, Episode 3. Today is just going to be different in the sense that we're going to be talking about the Big Ten's 2024 through 2028 schedules, and I guess just brainstorming and daydreaming about the future of the conference and talking about, what do you think about the schedules? And who do you think is the best opportunity to take advantage of said schedules? Who do you think got the short end of the stick, long end of the stick? What are your thoughts on it? So that's what we're going to do today. That's the plan. How are you guys doing? How are you all doing? And we got 10 of you in here, 4 likes. Perfect. Brownie College Football. Sam, how can I watch this and the Nebraska-Illinois prediction at the same time? Maybe that was a bad move by me. I intended to get that video out like an hour earlier. Unfortunately, though, I couldn't. But it just is what it is. I would ultimately say, if I had to make a choice, I'd say, watch this right now, and then when I'm done at 8, you can go back and watch Nebraska versus Illinois. But that's just my opinion. Read some earlier chats, and then we'll get right into it here. Will says, great, Sam, how are you? I'm hungry. I'm also a little tired, but I did eat 2 meals today so far, and I am going to have a big dinner. So I'm good for an hour, if not longer, to talk about scheduling. And perfect, Brownie College Football. You made a good decision. And also, Rutgers being an 8-4 team in no time. I'm going to release a video talking about Wisconsin and Rutgers tomorrow, along with some other content. So we'll just have to see where that goes. A lot of people are picking Rutgers to cover and outright win, which I think is possible. Another comment from earlier. Michigan might have the toughest schedule in college football in 2024. USC, Washington, Oregon, Texas, and Ohio State. Michigan is a really tough schedule, but we'll get into all of that. Another few people are talking to me. I'm doing good, for any of you asking. But let's get right into the schedule, and let's just have a conversation and really talk about it first and foremost. Okay, so here I am. I'm, in the corner, down in the screen, just so that we can see, everyone's teams that they're facing. What comes out to you? Like, what do you think when you see this schedule right here? These are the Big Ten's 2024 conference opponents right here. We have all of them. All 18 teams. What are you thinking? I can tell you all that I look here and, Michigan, Oregon, Illinois, Ohio State even. There are plenty of teams that have very tough schedules. I mean, Illinois, you see that away they have Nebraska, Northwestern, Oregon, Penn State, Rutgers, and at home they get Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, and Purdue. That's very tough. That's some tougher than the typical Big Ten West schedule that Illinois has been accustomed to. And you could say the same for Iowa, for Minnesota, Nebraska, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Purdue. I mean, look at Iowa, for example. They're going to have to travel to UCLA, Ohio State, Minnesota, Michigan State, and Maryland, and they're hosting Washington, Wisconsin, Northwestern, and Nebraska. That's probably one of the easier schedules on this list, and that's going to be a challenge for Kirk Ferentz if he is still the head coach next year. He's reaching an age where obviously he could retire at any point, and it wouldn't be surprising. But what do you think with this schedule? This is one I've looked at, and I imagine a lot of you have as well. So I might talk less about specific games just because I've seen this one multiple times. But what do you think? Michigan also loses a lot, I think is what Will was trying to say. So he thinks they'll have 4 losses. Hi, Guardian. What's up, Sam? I think the haters that have been hating on the new conference alignment are missing in action today. Oh, yes, because the Big Ten is probably now the deepest conference in all of college football. Quo Vadis says, not a good year to be a Sparty. Beetle. Is the Big 18 keeping divisions? I think that's what you meant to say. Are they keeping divisions? The answer is no. They're going to move to a divisionless format. And the best 2 teams out of these 18 will play for Indianapolis or Las Vegas. They'll play for the Big Ten championship game. I think that the Big Ten needs to institute a 4-team conference championship playoff, because there are going to be several top 10 caliber teams in this conference who will not be able to showcase their talents if we keep it to a 2-team championship opportunity, which is currently decided by 1 game. I think making a 4-team conference championship playoff, you have 2 more games, which would be more entertainment, more revenue, but also more teams would have a shot of a Big Ten championship. 2, you'd have a Cinderella story at times. Maybe Iowa or Rutgers, some of these teams in the 2024 schedules who I think have it easier than others, use their easier schedules to their advantage, and they get in, and many people think that they're not going to do anything, or they're a freebie for maybe the 1 seed or the 2 seed, and they end up winning. And maybe we have, a surprise conference champion. And then, obviously, number 3, more teams get a shot. So I think that it's a good proposal. I've mentioned it earlier, but that's just my opinion. I think that in 2024, personally, I think Penn State will probably be the team to beat. Early on, I think that Ohio State, and by early on I mean just from what I know right now, we don't know much about the 2024 teams. I think Ohio State, on virtue of their talent and their coaching, will probably be the best team in the Big Ten in 2024. Michigan loses a lot, and I think with where Michigan's going to go this season, which likely will be an improvement off of last year, which means either going 14-1 or 15-0, I think it looks like that is likely, but that's not decided. If that occurs, Michigan is going to be losing practically everyone who has a shot to go to the NFL. And that would include J.J. McCarthy. That would include some backups as well who are eligible. And Michigan, in my mind, would just lose too much. And they have USC, Oregon, Washington, and Ohio State on the road. That's a lot to ask for that team to be the best in the Big Ten. And also to reach the conference championship game, to reach Indianapolis or Las Vegas. Ohio State, going back to what I was saying, I think they'd be better than Penn State, but they have a road game at Oregon, and Penn State has home field advantage, and they also have road games at Northwestern and Michigan State, and they host Michigan, host Iowa, Nebraska, Purdue, Indiana. Penn State, by comparison, plays on the road at USC, which I think will be an easier opponent, an easier matchup than on the road at Oregon, and their other road games are at Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Purdue. They don't have 2 likely ranked road trips, unlike Ohio State. And Penn State hosts Ohio State, and then Washington, UCLA, Maryland, and Illinois. And I think Penn State might be number 1 in the Big Ten in returning production, depending on who all comes back for the Nittany Lions. But I think they'll definitely be in the top half. They return their 2 running backs, their quarterback, Drew Aller. They'll return several defensive players like Abdul Carter, for example. And I imagine there will be players at defensive tackle, backup defensive ends like Donnie Dennis-Sutton who aren't starting. He'll return. And look, I think Penn State's set up for having their best season in a while and having their best team in easily over a decade in 2024. Not just by who they return, but also by their schedule. I see 11-1 or 12-0 with Penn State's schedule, but that's just me. Let's read the chat. MSU has a pretty good schedule, especially compared to this year, says Zach Scout. I agree. Originally, Michigan State was slated to play Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan. That changed. Penn State was taken out, and a road trip at Oregon was introduced. Now, look, Oregon's a tough team. They're going to be starting Ty Thompson at quarterback there in 2024, and they're recruiting extremely well. But, with the right head coach, Michigan State has 5 home games. They do not have a tough non-conference slate. They have Boston College and 2 Group of 5 schools. They should go 3-0 there. Indiana, Iowa, Purdue, Rutgers, I think all are beatable at home. And Illinois is beatable on the road. Maryland's beatable on the road. Ohio State at home and Michigan and Oregon on the road. Michigan State could go 9-3 in 2024 with the right head coach and the right portal additions. I mean, then again, they could also go like 5-7 or 4-8. That's the beauty of these schedules, is the variety. In my opinion, at least, there's so much variety of outcomes and also matchups. There'll be teams playing, all the way on the West Coast or all the way on the East Coast. Brownie College football. I want USC and UCLA to go to the bank in November when the temperature is sub 10. Oh, that in year 1. I'm telling you, November road games for those Pac-12 schools, unless you're Washington or Oregon, just because they're built to be more physical, but also because they're more used to the colder climate. If USC travels to Michigan in November, Michigan will blow them out. And it's the same thing for most, competent, good Big Ten, original, like pre-2024 Big Ten teams, I think would do that to USC and UCLA in the month of November. USC and UCLA are totally built for warm climate, fast-paced, up-tempo, quick action. Washington and Oregon can, I think, switch to chewing clock, running it out, and they also play in a colder climate. 3rd and 8. Hey, Sam, I know we don't, as Michigan fans, talk about quarterback for next year. What are your thoughts on next year's quarterback? Is it going to be Alex, G, or Jaden Davis, Jaden Denegal? I personally like Alex Orji, but that's because he has insane upside in both passing, but especially running. However, he does have a lot of accuracy issues. I would hate to start Jaden Davis as a true freshman. I think we either start Alex Orji, Jaden Denegal, or we go to the portal. That's my thoughts on Michigan's quarterback play. Michigan, too. Michigan's a team who could win the Big Ten in 2024. I mean, there are so many teams who can, and I don't want to turn this into a 2024 preview segment, and I'm not going to, but Michigan could be number 1 in the Big Ten. Penn State and Ohio State, definitely. I think those are going to be the top 2 teams in 2024. If Michigan follows through on being the number 1 team in the country, and it looks like they are. USC, I think if they fire Alex Grinch, immediately is in that conversation. Washington, Oregon, it depends on who they return. I'd say Oregon, though, with more talent, is more likely to be a conference contender than Washington. UCLA is a sneaky case. I'd keep my eye on them in the same way that I would maybe Maryland or Michigan State, where they have enough talent and enough development, and if they have the right coaches, assistants, and head guys in position, they could make a move, but I don't think they'd be in that, they'd be a dark horse championship contender. Some other things that stuck out to me, Wisconsin, on the road at USC, they get a typical Big Ten West schedule outside of that, and then at home they have Penn State, Oregon, Minnesota, Purdue. Wisconsin has an easier or moderate conference schedule. However, they do play Alabama. I think they host Alabama in 2024. So they're going to have one of the tougher schedules in the country unless they cancel that game. Washington plays UCLA, USC, and Oregon. So they have some geographic familiarity, at least more so than USC, who's just playing Washington and UCLA, only 2 teams. UCLA is only playing Oregon. Well, they're 3. They have 3 geographically familiar opponents like Washington. Oregon's schedule: Michigan, UCLA, Wisconsin, Purdue on the road, and then Ohio State, Michigan State, Maryland, Illinois, and Washington at home. That is going to be a gauntlet. Now, I don't know who Oregon's non-conference schedule is, so maybe it's not as tough of a schedule as I think, but I bet it's a tough schedule. Looking at that, I'm going to check the chat in a few minutes, but I want to really get through this so then we can look at, 25, 26, 27, 28, because I want us to all look at those together. And for those schedules, I'll go through and probably list most of the games for most of the Big Ten teams. Nebraska, go Big Red. Now that Michigan's played them and beaten them soundly, I hope they win out, even though that's unlikely. Road games at USC, who they've played a few times in, the recent 2 decades. They also played UCLA as well in a home-and-home series in the Big Ten. USC they played where they were still in the Big 12. USC on the road, Purdue on the road, Ohio State, Iowa, Indiana on the road as well. Illinois, Rutgers, UCLA, and Wisconsin at home. A lot of these Big Ten West teams, because of some rivalries and also, I think I don't know exactly how it worked out that way, but some of these Big Ten West teams do have some lighter schedules, almost like a good way of leading them into the process of playing elite competition. Minnesota, on the other hand, I don't think got so lucky. They have Wisconsin, UCLA, Rutgers, Michigan, and Illinois on the road, and they have USC, Penn State, Maryland, and Iowa at home. Minnesota has a gauntlet of a schedule. I mean, if PJ Fleck were to have another 10-win season, his second in the regular season, that would be an immediate top 10 team with a schedule like this. I think that the Big Ten, having 6 of the current top 10 teams in all of college football, at least according to the AP poll, and according to my potential power, they have over 10 of the top 30 teams by potential power. The Big Ten is just dominant. Minnesota's going to have to recruit better, develop better. I saw a comment from Brownie College Football, a Minnesota and Clemson fan, talking about that. Some other schedules that jump out to me, we've pretty much talked about all of them here. Oh, Rutgers, Michigan State, Nebraska, USC, and Maryland on the road. They can probably beat anyone except USC on the road. I'm not going to even expect for Rutgers to compete in that game for more than a quarter or two, especially since I don't know if it'll be in November or not, and it won't matter regardless because it's on the road. Home games against Minnesota, UCLA, Illinois, Washington, Wisconsin. If Rutgers returns everyone again and they're good this year, that's a sleeper team. They avoid Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan, and UCLA and Washington are going to have to travel from coast to coast. There's going to be jet lag, and the student athletes will not be used to that, nor will the coaching staff. The effects of that travel will diminish over time as the coaches get used to it, the players get used to it. They'll introduce training methods and strategies to overcome that. Rutgers, this sounds crazy. I could see 7-2 or 8-1, depending on who they return, what they use in the portal, and how good they are this year. USC's the only for sure loss. They avoid the big three. They easily avoid the big three. Hummus Hero says Washington looks to have the toughest draw to me. Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, UCLA, USC, potentially 5 of the top 6 or 7 in the league. He accidentally put Washington in there, but that's okay. We all make mistakes. I mean, I make one or more every video if you look at it from an optimization standpoint, but mistakes are a part of humanity. Washington's schedule, and then we'll move on to 2025. Indiana, Iowa, Oregon, Penn State, and Rutgers on the road. That's tough. Michigan, Northwestern, UCLA, and USC are at home. What I like about Washington is they get Michigan, UCLA, and USC at home. I like that. And Husky Stadium is loud. And Washington will probably have a better defense than 3 of their 4 home games, and probably have a better offense unless Caleb Williams returns than 3 of their 4 home games as well, because I love Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer that much. Michigan will be a tough ask, and then Penn State, Oregon on the road, even Iowa on the road. That'll be a tough ask. And potentially Rutgers too, depending on when the seasons are, even Indiana. But I think Washington is a good enough O-line, and with Cameron Davis returning next year if he's healthy, he's been out for this entire season due to a preseason injury. Washington could contend as well. I mean, there are just so many good Big Ten teams. It's absolutely nuts how many good Big Ten teams there are. We're going to read the comments. Blank name. It's possible that UCLA is better than USC next year. Caleb will be gone, and I believe in Dante Moore. Caleb Williams has alluded to the fact that he might return next year just because he's paid 7 figures in NIL easily. And I don't think he doesn't want to play for certain teams in the NFL. He doesn't. And with money, and he's going to be better protected in college than he will ever be in the NFL due to talent advantage, why wouldn't you return if you're getting paid several millions of dollars? I agree with you, Moose, back-to-back Big Ten. Michigan will have a down year. We'll take a step back. We'll have the ceiling to be an elite team in 2024, I think, with how we've developed over the past several years. Remember, we didn't return a lot of production in 2022, and yet we improved drastically. So there's the possibility of that. But I do think we'll have a down year. I see, with our schedule, and this is probably being optimistic, I see 9-3, 10-2, 11-1 are the likely outcomes, in my opinion. And that's including, Texas at home on the schedule. I think Michigan will still be a top 10 team, but top 4, top 5, top 6, no. I think Penn State and Michigan, not Penn State, Michigan, Penn State and Ohio State will be better. Muse Trick, what are some schematic advantages you see between new teams and old teams, much like big lines versus agile lines, etc.? Okay, so I'm going to be transitioning to the 2025 conference opponents, and I think here, when talking about these games, is when we'll talk more about schematics, because we won't know who all will be here in 25, 26, 27, 28, with the transfer portal, with the draft, with just everything. We won't know. There's a lot more unknowns now with the transfer portal, and even with conference realignment. So, some schematic advantages between new teams and old teams. Here's what I think the new teams have. All of the new teams are built like Ohio State. All of them. They're built like 2021 Ohio State, where they are pure speed, pure skill position. Of course, 2021 OSU had a better line than almost all of these teams will have next year, outside of maybe Oregon and Washington. All of them are built like 2021 OSU, which means USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, at least SC, the Huskies, and the Ducks. UCLA might not have the raw talent and depth to do this. Those 3 and maybe 4 could come into the Big Ten and no matter what, just destroy the Indianas, Illinois, Northwesterns, Maryland's, Rutgers, maybe even Iowa's, Minnesota's, and Wisconsin's and Purdue's. Purdue should be included in the former category of the world. And Nebraska's too. SC, Washington, and Oregon, I'd say, are going to be top 6 teams. The problem is, when comparing them to Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan, I think those 3, the big 3 of the Big Ten right now, have a much larger advantage. Ohio State has speed and size. That's why they dominated the conference for so long. Michigan now has speed, and they have even bigger size than Ohio State. At least they have over the past 2 seasons, and this year I think they do as well. Penn State has been a lot like Ohio State, where they have speed. Their trench play is questionable, but their perimeter play is just awesome. Like, looking at their defensive backs, historically their wide receivers. I think that the incoming Pac-12 teams have the advantage, a huge advantage over the bottom 7 Big Ten teams, but their ceiling, I think, is lower than even some teams like Wisconsin, at least initially, just because of how they're built and how that'll impact with travel time, the weather, and look, the weather and travel time are small factors in comparison with Rutgers' defense this season in the Big Ten. You place Rutgers in the Pac-12, and outside of like Utah, they probably have the best defense in the Pac-12. So these offenses, they could be like Ohio State's in 2021 and just immediately wreck most teams they face when they come to the Big Ten, or they could be all exposed as gimmicks, and we are laughing and darn near peeing our pants watching USC being held to like 20 points while Penn State's scoring like 50 on them because they haven't faced great defenses and they're not used to that. Meanwhile, the Big Ten can just counterpunch in the run game against weak defenses like UCLA's and USC's, and Washington's and Oregon's have shown vulnerabilities defensively as well. By the way, quick announcement, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed or liked the live stream, please do. And thank you very much for your support. We just broke 11,600 subscribers just yesterday, and I wanted to shoot that out. But looking at 2025, I think it's especially important to look at schematics, because even though the coaches aren't guaranteed to be at these respective schools, they're Pac-12 teams. They've had similar identities for a while. USC's always, like even under Clay Helton and Lane Kiffin, like what do they want to do? They want to pass. Now, of course, Lincoln Riley's offense is heavily reliant on the run, but they still have that, insane pass element to them where they have an elite passing attack. And Clay Helton and Lane Kiffin wanted to do that as well. It was different with the run attack. At least for Clay Helton especially. But we don't know if Lincoln Riley or Kalen DeBoer or Dan Lanning or Chip Kelly will still be at their respective schools, but seeing the deals they have and the fact that we can safely assume they're going to be in the top half of the Big Ten, like the top 8 of the Big Ten, we can assume they'll be here for a long time, especially since Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA are all going to be great jobs as they were in the Big Ten and outside of UCLA as they were in the Pac-12. Looking at 2025, and before that, I want to read the chat because it is just, the chat's boiling at this point with action. Michigan will go 8-4. I'm seeing a lot of 8-4 with Michigan, and that's a possibility. Michigan most likely loses to Ohio State, Oregon, possibly Texas. I agree with that. Weather will be rough for the LA schools first couple of years, especially with the Grinch defense. I agree with that. Darren talks ball. Styles make fights, which is why this smashing together of the college football universe is all the more compelling. Penn State has no wide receivers, and Aller can't hit the broadside of a barn. Penn State's offense this year, just want to quickly shoot this out. I know this isn't talking about this season. Their offense is dysfunctional. Like, I said in the preseason, a bold prediction of mine is that Michigan and Ohio State would, score a combined nearly 90 points on this defense and, blow out Penn State. The 90 points might be incorrect and probably will, the combined, due to the, clock rules and also due to the fact that Penn State's defense is better than I thought. But there's a possibility that could happen because Penn State's offense is dysfunctional. And if they go 3-and-out, 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 Ohio State and Michigan's offenses have a trench advantage with Penn State's defense, and they could totally lean on Penn State and just open that entire can of worms. They have Keandre Lambert-Smith, who's a great wide receiver, and Aller has shown upside, but I'm very concerned about Penn State's capability of winning the Big Ten and improving compared to last year. Their offense objectively is worse than it was last year through 5 games. It's absolutely worse. Their trench play looks worse, and I say that because their running back room is deeper, and yet it's performing worse. And the fact that their longest rushes of 21 yards, some of that's on the running backs, but I think a lot of that's on the O-line. I think the losing Juice Scruggs, I think, has had a bigger impact than a lot of people like to think. And their tackle room hasn't been as good as I thought it would be. And also Aller not being as experienced as Clifford, I think you're seeing some of that bleed through the offense. But the defense is, the defense could be the best in college football. That's how good the defense is. And their defensive tackle room has impressed me. I thought it was a weakness, and I think it still is on the defense, but it's one of the better defensive tackle rooms now in Power 5 football. Yeah. So there are concerns with Penn State here, but to get back on topic, 2025, Illinois plays Indiana, Purdue, Washington, and Wisconsin on the road, and they play Maryland, Northwestern, Ohio State, Rutgers, and USC at home. Indiana on the road, Iowa, Maryland, Oregon, Penn State, Purdue. They host Illinois, Michigan State, UCLA, Wisconsin. Iowa plays Nebraska, Rutgers, USC, Wisconsin on the road, and they host Indiana, Michigan State, the Golden Gophers in Minnesota, Oregon, and Penn State. Maryland on the road plays Illinois, Michigan State, Rutgers, UCLA. They host Indiana, Michigan, Nebraska, Washington. Michigan looks to have an easier schedule in 2025. They play Maryland, Michigan State, Nebraska, Northwestern, and USC on the road. They host Ohio State, Purdue, Washington, and Wisconsin, though. There's no Oregon here. Michigan State, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, USC on the road, and then Maryland, Michigan, Penn State, and UCLA at home. The Golden Gophers, PJ Fleck, Minnesota. They get Iowa, Northwestern, Ohio State, Oregon on the road. Michigan State, Nebraska, Purdue, Rutgers, and Wisconsin at home. Nebraska, just give me a few more seconds. Maryland, Minnesota, Penn State, UCLA away. At home, Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, and USC. And Illinois, Nebraska, Penn State, and USC on the road for Northwestern. Michigan, Minnesota, Oregon, Purdue, and UCLA at home for the Wildcats in Evanston. We're going to talk about those and then, go over the schedules for the remaining 8 teams. Looking at this, Michigan's schedule definitely improves in terms of winnable games from 2024 to 2025. Michigan State, they don't play Ohio State, but they have to play Michigan, Penn State, UCLA, Maryland. All 4 of those home games will likely be competitive, looking at, how those programs function. And their away games, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and then USC. That's brutal again for Michigan State. For Minnesota, their schedule, I think, gets tougher. They have to play Iowa, Ohio State, and Oregon on the road. Northwestern's schedule is brutal with Penn State, Michigan, USC, and Oregon, UCLA, and Nebraska. Nebraska, Rule will be in year 3, by the way, with Nebraska. So keeping that trend in mind, and with their schedule of Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Northwestern, USC at home, and then Maryland, Minnesota, Penn State, and UCLA on the road, they could be a good 2025 team. Again, we're getting far into the future now, so you're not going to hear me talking about all different kinds of record projections and what I think. I think we'll return to 2024 rather shortly at the end of the video to talk about some of my early thoughts on the 2024 season. But my initial thoughts on 2025 are Iowa has a tough schedule. Minnesota and Northwestern. A lot of the Big Ten West teams have tough draws. Illinois does. Indiana's isn't as bad. Their toughest games will be on the road at Oregon and Penn State, but Purdue, Maryland, and Iowa, those are teams that if the right head coach comes to Indiana, if they recruit well and stay healthy, they could win those games. Illinois, Michigan State, UCLA, and Wisconsin at home. Indiana, I think, of course, if all things hold constant, alternate, predicting the future is hard, but if things generally hold constant in the Big Ten for at least another season, that's a good schedule for Indiana, especially seeing that I think Tom Allen's gone after this year, which means whatever head coach will be, at Indiana will be in year 2 at this point. Those are just my brief thoughts on this schedule. Maryland seems to get a solid draw. Now looking for the remaining 8 teams, Oregon, at Iowa, at Northwestern, at Penn State, at Rutgers, at Washington, and hosting Indiana, Minnesota, USC, and Wisconsin. Let me see what you guys are talking about here. Washington won't be as good in 2024. Penix will be gone. Yeah, but Austin Mack and Dylan Morris, I think they won't exactly replace him. And also some of their wide receivers will be gone. But Washington, I'm very curious to see how they look in 2024. I have faith in DeBoer and the staff, and I think the defense is just destined to get better as time goes on, but we'll have to see. Moose as well. I think this is Bo Nix's last season, yes, but he has Ty Thompson behind him. Washington and Oregon, another schematic advantage they have, and with USC and UCLA, this is similar. They will have quarterback depth. Those 4 teams could have their quarterbacks go down for the whole season, and they plug and play with quarterbacks, much like what Ohio State can do right now. If Kyle McCord goes down and Devin Brown has to start, There will, of course, be some drop-off, but it wouldn't be like if McCarthy goes down and Davis Warren has to start behind him. Like, the Big Ten has been very thin at quarterback. They'll become deeper at quarterback by adding these schools, and that will give these schools an advantage in some instances. The worst offense in the Big 18, that'll have to be Iowa. That'll be Iowa or Indiana every year, unless things change easily. Allers had the shortest yards per pass attempt of any Big Ten quarterback by a mile. He struggles to complete things downfield. I absolutely agree. I think JJ stays in 2024, even if we win the championship game, similar to Caleb Williams' NIL situation. There is a possibility of that, because he has the eligibility. And with his height and weight, even if we win a national title, he could improve his draft stock. It won't be like Caleb Williams, where his draft stock can only go down, like if he suffers an injury or if he starts playing horribly. JJ will, if he wants to max his draft stock, he should stay. But I think if we win a national title, or even if we just go 13-1 again and he improves, he'll probably be a first-round pick. USC, besides their conference schedules, LSU and Notre Dame, yeah, that's something. Their schedule is brutal, but if they get like a Jim Knowles or a Manny Diaz or a Jesse Minner as defensive coordinator, if Williams returns and Grinch is replaced by a more competent DC, they'd immediately be a top 4 team in my book with the offense that they have, and Zachariah Branch and those different players. Do you think the Big Ten rebrands with so many teams? No, because it would lose catchiness, and it would lose one of the last vestiges of tradition, according to a lot of people. I don't think that happens. It could, but I just don't think so. Okay, Ohio State, away games at Illinois, Michigan, Purdue, Washington, Wisconsin, home games against Penn State, Rutgers, UCLA, and Minnesota. Penn State, their schedule gets tougher. On the road at Iowa, on the road at Michigan State, same thing with Ohio State, Rutgers, and UCLA, and Indiana, Nebraska, Northwestern, and Oregon at home. With Purdue, they play Michigan, Minnesota, Northwestern, and Washington on the road, and Illinois, Indiana, Ohio State, Rutgers, and USC at home. That has to be one of the toughest schedules of 2025. USC, Ohio State, and Michigan, and I would say Penn State. Those 4, I'd say long-term have the best chance of, winning big in the Big Ten. For USC, it's just their name brand, blue blood, and the fact that they're literally a competent defense. If Riley ever divests himself completely from Lincoln Riley, or not from Lincoln Riley, yeah, he separates himself from himself. That makes sense, Sam. If he just removes Alex Grinch, which at some point it will no longer be funny, I will be begging him to do so, despite the fact that I'm a Michigan fan, and Grinch being at USC makes Michigan's job easier. If he gets an elite DC, then he wins a national title. That's a guarantee. If he has an elite defense paired with his offense, which people will say, oh, that's impossible. Look at Georgia last year. Georgia didn't have anything generational on either side of the football in 2022, and they had some issues at secondary, and their running back room wasn't deep, but overall they had an elite staff on offense, an elite staff on defense. They had an elite defense and a near-elite offense. Of course, the reason why Ohio State nearly beat them, and the reason why there's an argument that Michigan could have beaten them, is because those 2 teams were also elite. Elite teams can beat elite teams, after all. But you can't have an elite defense and elite offense. Ask past USC teams as well, like in 2004 and 2005. Ask Alabama in 2020. Their defense wasn't coordinated at an elite level, but they had really deep players. Ask Ohio State in 2019. You can't have an elite defense and an elite offense. But Purdue, very tough schedule. Rutgers, they have Illinois, Minnesota, Ohio State, Purdue, and Washington on the road. Iowa, Maryland, Oregon, and Penn State at home. For UCLA, they have Indiana, MSU, Northwestern, Ohio State, and USC on the road, but Maryland, Nebraska, Penn State, and Washington at home. For USC and Washington, they have 4 away games like Wisconsin and also 5 home games. The away games for SC are Illinois, Nebraska, Oregon, Purdue, and at home, Michigan, Iowa, Michigan State, Northwestern, and UCLA. Keep in mind, none of these games are scheduled with dates or times. These are just the parameters for how many home games, how many away games, and what schools are we playing. Washington travels to play Maryland, Michigan, UCLA, and Wisconsin. They host Illinois, Ohio State, Oregon, Purdue, and Rutgers. And then finally for Wisconsin, they play at Indiana, Michigan, rival Wisconsin, and Oregon, and they host Illinois, Iowa, Maryland, Ohio State, and Washington, which I'm slightly blocking. My apologies. I see that we got some chat revenue. Thank you to Chris Lane for supporting the channel. Your support is never expected, but it is always appreciated. I try very hard to, whenever I see a super chat or notice it, to immediately point it out. Thank you very much, very, very much to Chris Lane for supporting the channel and also being a long-time subscriber, commenter, and Buckeye. Ohio State fans, Michigan fans, Nebraska fans, Big Ten fans in general are great. Really enjoy your time on the channel. Thank you for your comment. And yeah, it's too hard to look beyond 2023. I'm just doing it because it's fun, but it's purely theoretical. Purely. One more thing on Aller. His ESPN QBR was like 41.7. That's brutal. It's totally brutal. Aller, very high. Aller right now reminds me of a more sluggish J.J. McCarthy from last year. The only area in which Aller is better than McCarthy last year is physical size, which will protect him from injury, and also the fact that he isn't as turnover prone. But McCarthy last year, much better runner. I think McCarthy last year also, while he had the capacity to make worse decisions, he also made some pretty amazing improvised plays as well. So I think that his decision-making has a higher upside than Aller's, at least comparing last year McCarthy to this year's Aller, but also had a lower floor. That's just my opinion. Music for me, 007, yeah, his quarterback rating's a 74.9 currently. He was just talking about in that specific game. No, if his QBR was that low, oh my gosh, you would be hearing, there'd probably be a video on that, if I'm being honest. But that's just my opinion, and looking at everything, we can't project really. I mean, we could project 2024, and I'll probably do that in my free time, maybe even tonight. Like, I'll privately go through and make some schedule predictions, but for 2025 and beyond, we really can't do anything. I'll show you for a few minutes each the 2026 and beyond schedules. Here they are. I'm really just going to talk about Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. Michigan has, looking at their schedule just continues in my mind to get easier. We're going to be playing Oklahoma in 25 and 26. 26 is scheduled for Michigan. They have Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon. Those are just some games that stick out to me. Just wanted to show this to you guys. And I'd say looking at these schedules, do you have any interest in looking at these schedules, or should we just quickly go through them, wait a few minutes just to, so we can all see and then move on? Washington will be playing Michigan State again. That's kind of funny. I can talk a little bit about like the far distant future. I expect Nebraska to be a competent team by this point. At this point with Michigan in 2026, Michigan by the late 2020s is going to have to be thinking about likely Jim Harbaugh not being there. But that's just my opinion. If this was the conference today, we would have 4 out of the top 6 quarterback rating guys. Yeah, McCarthy, Williams. McCarthy, Williams. Shoot, who am I missing? McCarthy, Williams, Penix. Who's the fourth? Is the fourth Kyle McCord, or is it Bo Nix? Who's the fourth? I can name three off the top of my head. But yeah, the Big Ten, I mean, quarterback, especially looking at the SEC right now, who's a good SEC quarterback? It's Connor Weigman or Max Johnson. Texas A&M is a very deep quarterback room. It's either one of them or Jaden Daniels. That's like it. And Spencer Rattler. Graham Mertz, I know he's looked better, but in my mind, he's probably just good or average now. He's not even close to being elite whatsoever. And yeah, the conference is going to get ridiculously top-heavy. For Indiana, the dream will be going bowling. And same for Northwestern. But the schedules are balanced enough to where they, under the right coach with enough returning production, and maybe just a few good recruits or transfer portal additions, they could maybe come out and, shock the world. That's why I think the Big Ten, again, needs that 4-team conference championship playoff format. Because then you can get more teams. You can get more teams will have the opportunity to compete for, a championship. And I think that'd be very good. But then again, that's just my opinion. Gavin Wimsatt and Talia Tagovailoa are also in the top 30 of quarterback rating. Wimsatt, very great on the ground. He's about average through the air, but he'll probably improve as time goes on. And that offense with Kirk Shiraka is going to be more reliant on the quarterback than Sean Gleason's was, and they have a great run game, an improved O-line. Rutgers is a team that, watching them this season, I wouldn't be surprised if Schiano's finally turned the corner. And I had a very hard time seeing that, at least for this season. I thought it was going to take him until 2024 to be like, okay, now you have a team who can be ranked at some point in the season. He might have that this year. This Rutgers team, with their physicality and trench play, I could see them beating Wisconsin Saturday. They could totally go into Camp Randall. They could go, if Luke Fickell isn't prepared, or if his team just isn't tough, Rutgers could go into Camp Randall and do to Wisconsin what Illinois did last year. They could totally do that. I could see that happening. Now, I'm going to be talking about what I think about that game in my preview and prediction for it tomorrow. I don't think that'll happen. I think it'll be a closer game, but it's a possibility. I imagine you have seen enough of these schedules. Let me know if you want to move on from this to 2027. I hope you're right about Nebraska. Definitely need stability in our program. Yeah. They need a win tomorrow. By the way, I predicted Nebraska to win 31-20 tomorrow night. So, Cornhuskers, please don't disappoint me. Also, good point. Very, very, very good point. Trying to find the comment here. Gavin Wimsatt has been better than Tanner Mordecai so far. That's a good point. I think that Wisconsin is the deeper quarterback room, and I typically factor that into my position breakdown, so don't be surprised if you see Wisconsin ranked ahead in quarterback. That's also because Gavin Wimsatt, outside of the Michigan game, hasn't played anyone. Tanner Mordecai's played, I think, a tougher, in general, an average tougher opponent. Michigan obviously being a massive outlier for both teams if Wisconsin and Rutgers were to both play Michigan. Okay, here's 2027. Looking at Ohio State, I didn't look at them for 2026, but it doesn't really matter. Michigan, Minnesota, Northwestern, Oregon, and Rutgers on the road. For Penn State, Penn State doesn't play. They play Michigan, but they don't play Ohio State. That's very weird, because I typically look at Penn State, Ohio State as a rivalry, not Michigan, Penn State. But Penn State, I'm telling you, them not playing Ohio State and Michigan every year with how they are, and especially the fact that they're established in the Big Ten, maybe James Franklin turns the corner. I'm surprised that I'm even saying that, but these schedules are so advantageous, for Penn State, in my mind. Sam, I will be 37 years old in 2027. I would rather not talk about it. Wow. Yeah. This comment, I think, spot on. A group of 5 quarterback and a group of 5 coach would take time in Wisconsin. I think you were right about the quarterback for sure. With Luke Fickell, we have to see. We just have to see. Because if Wisconsin can figure out their run game, and they have been, and their wide receiver room is better than it has, it's its best since Quintez Cephas in 2019, and they have guys at linebacker and at secondary, they can still be a dangerous team. Like, in my mind, they're going to be far and away the favorites to win the West. But I could be wrong. Hummus Hero, I don't believe Rutgers is a good team, not until I see them play quality opponents and beat them. I think they're above average right now. Maybe good. Definitely not great. Wisconsin, that's going to be a big test. If they beat Wisconsin, they'll be 5-1. They'll likely go bowling. You probably will see them like at the 25th spot if they go on the road and beat Wisconsin, in my top 25 at least. By the way, guys, I see a lot of ages of 44, 52, 37. You guys, honestly, it's like kind of, sweet to see, different people from anywhere within college football fan bases. I'm a 20-year-old turning 21 in about a month. So, yeah. Kind of interesting. Okay, 2028, I'm just going to look at Michigan, probably look at Penn State again, Ohio State, Purdue, Washington, Wisconsin on the road for Michigan, and then Maryland, Michigan State, Nebraska, Northwestern, USC at home. Penn State, again, they have a home game against Ohio State, and then they really don't play like anyone else. Oregon, USC, maybe Nebraska on the road at that point becomes like a game that everyone doesn't want to play. But Ohio State at home, no Michigan. I'm telling you, Penn State scheduling-wise will have a huge advantage over most teams, especially Ohio State and Michigan, because they've elected to play each other every year. And they should. For tradition's sake, and also for the fact that Michigan and Ohio State consequentially, while they could on average get more losses than Penn State, they'll be better tested than Penn State will. And that'll help them in a 12-team playoff where you can get in with 2 and maybe even 3 losses. Ohio State has Illinois, Maryland, Penn State, UCLA on the road. They have Michigan, Minnesota, Rutgers, Washington, and Wisconsin at home. USC, Penn State, Nebraska, Iowa, and Purdue at home, and then Michigan, Michigan State, Oregon, UCLA, and Northwestern on the road. Washington that season is Ohio State and Michigan on their schedule. So that's very interesting. But that's all I want to talk about in regards to 2028, 2027. I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about 2024 and just some of my thoughts overall. The chat, by the way, has been very active tonight, and thank you guys so much for that. That's awesome. And yeah, I can't legally drink, nor do I really want to. Drinking doesn't really appeal to me whatsoever. It doesn't. It's It is what it is. Okay. Sam seems to be way more mature than 20. Thought you were like 24. Well, I do have a lot to learn. For example, I have yet to move out of my parents' house, but that'll be the case sooner rather than later. And YouTube's doing well. This has about been the best week of the podcast and of the channel in quite some time. So, thank you for that compliment. Hey, Kels, how are you doing? Only thing I don't like about our scheduling is that Penn State isn't a protected rival. Yeah. I don't know whose fault that is. Like, fault. It could be both teams didn't want each other as a protected rival. I imagine Penn State wanted Ohio State as a protected rival, and Ohio State said no. because I think Ohio State would be punishing themselves by having two of the long-term top 3 programs on their schedule every year. And honestly, who knows? Maybe Penn State didn't want Ohio State's rival. Maybe Penn State looked at it and said, hey, we're probably going to have an easier time if we don't have any rivals. Maybe that was the thought process. So, a lot of different things. Oh yeah, and Kel's 14, I did see your message. Yeah, the economy, that doesn't help anyone. I did see that before you removed it. Yeah, I'll take my time while trying to do my best, all at the same time. And the eye test does it does matter, but at the same time, Rutgers has done this before where they dominate bad competition, and then let's just say, for example, Ryan Day just puts his hand over his chest, or whatever. Does some simple gesture, and Ohio State wins by 40. So we've seen this story before. Let's just see what happens. And yeah, they curb stomped Wagner. Like, what's a Wagner? For example, USC curb stomped Nevada. And then what did USC do? Their defense looked like digested burger after playing Colorado and Arizona State. It's ridiculous, man. By the way, USC, we'll talk about them in a few minutes. So for 2024, just briefly want to mention my initial thoughts, and then we'll talk a little bit about whatever we want to discuss for the final 10, 15 minutes of the show. Looking at this from a very early standpoint, I think that Ohio State and Penn State probably make it to Indy. If not one of them, I think Michigan would substitute in the other spot, just because I think for SC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon, they will have to adjust. I don't think either of them, unless it's SC with a new defensive coordinator, makes it to Indy, frankly. And USC playing 5 road games, 3 of them being in Big Ten territory, and Minnesota, Michigan, and Maryland will be no joke. All of those teams could beat USC. All of them won't, because USC is too much talent, but I could see 1 or 2 of them winning. And Penn State and even Wisconsin, if they return Braylon Allen and their O-line, they could match up very well with USC at home. USC will have a very high ceiling, but a low floor in 24. But I'd keep an eye on them. Definitely a top 4 team. I'd say Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, SC, in that order of how good teams are next year. That's just my early thoughts. And that's overall team. Jim Harbaugh will probably be, the best head coach in the Big Ten, followed by Ryan Day. Michigan just loses so much, and it would be biased of me to say that they'd run it back and go, if they win it this season. But I'm still thinking in terms of 2022. If they run it and go 12-0 or 13-0, that'd be incredible with how much they lost, and I don't think they'll do that. You can't have what Ohio State had under Tressel and Meyer was the byproduct of Michigan being down, of Penn State, having the late Joe Paterno in his later years coaching, and the scandal, and James Franklin just frankly not being a big-time head coach in big games. And also Michigan State, they had some good years, but they were never this consistent elite program outside of maybe from 13 to 15. So Ohio State's long streak was in part the byproduct of a Big Ten that was either consistent or down, but Ohio State leveled up. And I think Michigan now has leveled up and made it more competitive, but Ohio State hasn't taken a step back either. They're still up there. Michigan just has a schematic advantage and a mental advantage over Ohio State that I think they haven't adjusted to yet. Oregon, Washington, USC, they will be competitive. When the Big Ten initially announced the Flex Protect Plus schedule, Penn State had no protected rivals either, ending their yearly rivalry with Michigan State. Their brand is being unrivaled. Yeah. Totally. That will be the same thing that happens to Maryland after Ohio State beats them. Yeah. Maryland's very intriguing to me. I think Maryland has more fraud capacity than Rutgers, but Maryland also has a higher ceiling. So it's interesting. I love Coach Locke at Maryland, but he's got to use NIL and recruit better in the DMV area. Yeah, their recruiting has really fallen off. If they continued to recruit those top 25 classes, maybe we'd see a change. But a lot of those top 25 players, didn't, not top 25 players, but those players who were blue chip didn't pan out. Like, look at Terrence Lewis, for example. He's at UCF, and there were other linebackers and players who were on like their third or fourth schools. I think they recruited a lot of busts, and Loxley's trying to recruit guys that fit the culture. And I think that's better than hitting high and trying to get top 25, top 20 classes, but busting when it comes to players' character. Because his teams have been very clean, and they've been very together, and there weren't as many portal departures this preseason, I think, as compared to last preseason. But I could be wrong. That's just my opinion. NIL, I think, is the biggest. I think NIL is a bigger thing for Maryland than, recruiting better you have to do, but Penn State owns that area of recruiting. Like, that is Penn State's backyard in recruiting. It really much is. Looking at some other comments here. Those out-of-conference games for OSU and Michigan are brutal if you got time to cover them real quickly. Let me check Ohio State's out-of-conference games. Let's just see. And before we get to that, yeah, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, I still think are going to be the top three teams. Way too early for 2024. USC will probably sit comfortably at that fourth spot with room to move higher if they fire Grinch. Washington and Oregon will definitely be top 8. And then I think Rutgers, Maryland, Michigan State, and UCLA. Those 4 teams are and Nebraska, too. I don't want to discount Nebraska. Maybe Wisconsin or Minnesota. I think Wisconsin's going to lose a lot of production from this season, though. And Minnesota, I'm beginning to question PJ Fleck a bit. But watch out for those teams as well. We're going to go back to the big screen here, talk a little bit about some of my thoughts on Big Ten teams and also the out-of-conference games. So, 2024 Ohio State football schedule. Who do they play? Out of conference, they play no one in 2024 that I care about. In 2025, they host Texas. And in 2026, I imagine they're on the road at Texas. Okay. Yeah, that's brutal. And then for Michigan, let's go back to, not 2022. We're looking at 2024. Michigan. Michigan in 2024 hosts Texas. In 25, they play at Oklahoma. In 26, Michigan hosts Oklahoma. And in 27, they play at Texas. And then beyond that, in 28, Michigan was scheduled to play at Washington, but that's now a conference game. So that's, they're a conference opponent. So obviously that looks different. I can see that Texas series being 1-1. I think it's going to be 1-1 for Michigan. For Ohio State, I can see it being 1-1 or 2-0. Colorado, Kells, is going to the Big 12. Where I think Deion Sanders will win a few Big 12 championships, but that'll take longer than 2 or 3 years even, because his recruiting classes are small, and you can't again, his transfer portal class cannot be as big as it was. It can't. I think it's capped at like 25 incoming transfers. So he's going to have to be more selective, recruit better. There's just going to have to be different things that he's going to have to do. But I think he'll do them. I think he's a good head coach. We're just going to have to see, though, because predicting far into the future is tough. I love Carson Hinsman as well. Great center. Ohio State's strength of their O-line is their interior. Ryan Day, do not only run stretch. Please, thank you. Run a little bit of halfback dive and pound the rock. Thank you. And finally, talking about some thoughts on the Big Ten in general, like for this season. I look at the conference right now, it's very clearly Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State as the top three teams. Maryland and Rutgers could perhaps be fringe top 25. Wisconsin, I think, is a top 25 team. And outside of those six, it's pretty desolate. And Maryland and Rutgers and even Wisconsin could be mediocre teams. It could be the big three yet again. And I think it's very similar to last year how the Big Ten is, except this one thing. I think last year for most of the regular season, it looked like Ohio State was the clear one. Michigan was a close two. Penn State was somewhat of a distant third. This year it's very similar. I think Michigan statistically and by efficiency, very clear number one. I mean, from eye test, Michigan looks much better than Ohio State. But of course, part of that is the fact that Ohio State's actually played a great team, a top 10 team in Notre Dame on the road, who according to my own personal rankings and Potential Power is also top 10. Potential Power actually thinks, a little bit of a hint for you all, thinks that Notre Dame would beat Alabama on a neutral field by like a field goal. So Potential Power is very high on Notre Dame. And I wouldn't be shocked if Notre Dame goes 11-1, even though some people are picking them to lose to Louisville. Penn State, I think, is that distant third right now. I think Michigan and Ohio State have the much better offense than Penn State. And this is going to be bold, and people won't like this. I think they also have the better defense than Penn State does. Now, the defenses are all very close for Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. I mean, there's an argument for any of them to be one. I think Penn State's offense is a very clear third out of those three teams. And I think if you include other offenses, like Maryland's, for example, or maybe you want to go on a stretch and say, hey, Wisconsin, I know their quarterback play has been worse than Penn State, but their offensive line and run game has looked better. Penn State's offense could be worse than third in the conference. Their defense, I don't know. I think their defense has a high ceiling, maybe the highest in the conference. I think they have the best defensive end room in the Big Ten right now, at least in terms of depth. But I'm really bothered by how teams like whether it's Illinois or Northwestern, they've had more explosive plays and forced turnovers than Ohio State or Michigan. But teams have been able to more consistently drive on Penn State than they have on Ohio State and Michigan at the same time. And that's a problem. I think Michigan Man put it perfectly. Their D-line's undersized. Their pass rushers at times are better at stopping the run than their tackles are. That's never a good sign in a conference that loves interior trench play. And maybe I'm overreacting, but Penn State could very well have a rude awakening in Columbus. And with Maryland's on the road for Penn State, by the way, before Michigan. There are games for Penn State that, if they continue to look this sluggish, there are some non-top 10 teams that could catch Penn State by surprise. With Michigan and Ohio State, I don't think it's as easy to say that. I think that with the exception of Maryland for Michigan, just because it's sandwiched in between Penn State and Ohio State, it's an obvious trap game. For Ohio State, I think it's the same way with Minnesota. Outside of those two teams, no one is going to be coming up on Michigan or Ohio State unless it's Penn State before they play each other. No one. From how it looks, and I think advanced analytics agree with this, FPI doesn't, but FPI only cares about how many points you score and allow per game, which means a team like Penn State, who's run up the score, is going to be, favored over a team like Michigan who chews clock, FPI favors Penn State over Michigan. What this means is, well, not what this means. I think it's hard to argue that Penn State's better than Michigan and OSU, just looking at statistics. But then again, we're only 5 games in. Penn State could be the number 1 team in the Big Ten. I just think that there's a real possibility that Michigan and Ohio State do what they did last year, and they kind of blow everyone out, and then they face off as Titans in Ann Arbor. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think about that in the comments section. We're going to end this video, this live stream, very shortly. And I want to say again, thank you all for coming on. We've had about 30 concurrent viewers, at times a little higher, at times a little lower. This is very great. Thank you, Grass, for coming on. Good luck this week to you as well. My playoff teams have stayed the same, but I replaced Alabama with Texas. Penn State moved up from 4 to 2. Michigan stays at 1. Florida State stays at 3. My playoff prediction, this is going to be the last thing I'll talk about. It was Michigan at 1. No, Georgia at 1, Michigan 2, Washington 3, Penn State 4. With how Georgia has looked, I'm going to say currently, well, no. We don't overreact on this channel. What I will say is I'm leaning toward all of my picks being right, except for Ohio State. And that's not because I think Ohio State's any worse. I have them as the number 2 team in all of college football right now. Their problem is Texas will probably win out or get 1 loss. Florida State will probably get 1 loss, maybe 2, but if they get 1 loss, 12-1 ACC champion, 12-1 Big 12 champion. I think Oregon and Washington are clearly a step above the rest of the conference, likely a 12-1 Pac-12 champion. It looks like there are going to be 4 or maybe even 5 conference champions with 12 wins and only 1 loss, or potentially undefeated. That doesn't bode well for an Ohio State team that has to go on the road, who looks a little worse by the eye test, or perhaps even a sizable margin worse than Michigan does by the eye test right now, and they have to play on the road. It's just going to be difficult. It's going to be very, very difficult for Ohio State to get into the playoff without them beating Michigan and winning the Big Ten, but they can still do it. And if Ohio State goes 11-1 with the schedule they have and the teams they've beaten, and they'll probably play Michigan closer this year than they did last year, they'd probably be the first 11-1 team to back their way into the playoff effortlessly. I could see an 11-1 Ohio State, just on virtue of the opponents they've played, getting in over a 12-1 Georgia who lost in the SEC title. I could totally see that happening. See you guys later. Thank you, High Guardian. Thank you, Michigan Man. Thank you, Kells. Thank you, Richard. What do you think of Penn State, OSU, and Michigan all go 11-1? The most likely outcome of that is Penn State beats Michigan. Well, that's what we would typically think. I think if all of them go 11-1, here's what I think happens. If all of them go, I think there's a legitimate possibility that Michigan beats Penn State on the road, that all of them beat each other on the road. I think that's a possibility, because I think Michigan matches up better with Penn State than Ohio State does with Penn State. Primarily is that reason. If that happens, what likely occurs, due to the fact that Ohio State plays Wisconsin while Penn State and Michigan don't, is Ohio State would get the tiebreaker to go to Indy. If all of them go 11-1, Ohio State's likely the winner. Or Michigan, just because their brand, and also the fact that they so far have looked more impressive, and that's really it. Eye test would be huge in determining college football playoff rankings with the 11-1 teams. Penn State, Iowa doesn't look good. Illinois doesn't look good. Michigan plays Minnesota and Nebraska. There's a good chance that Minnesota and Nebraska are both better than Iowa and Illinois. We'll see about that this weekend. Really crazy. Also, Northwestern doesn't help Penn State's case. Meanwhile, Ohio State got Minnesota, you got Wisconsin, and then Purdue. Purdue being a dud, but Michigan plays Purdue as well. That would go in Ohio State's interest because the tiebreaker between three-way ties in the Big Ten, if it's in that round-robin type of win where Penn State beats Michigan, Michigan beats Ohio State, and Ohio State beats Penn State, the tiebreaker is who has the toughest West Division slate, and that would be Ohio State. So they would reach Indy, they'd probably win it. They'd be 12-1. Michigan and Penn State would be 11-1, and Michigan beating Ohio State, beating the Big Ten champion would get the nod at that point. Michigan would get the nod because they have the best win. They have the more recent, they have the best win, the best resume. Consequentially, they'd have the most eyes on them by the eye test. They'd look the best. Penn State, they would have the more distant loss, which would be their advantage. But an 11-1 Michigan that beat Ohio State would totally get in over an 11-1 Penn State, at least in my mind. There's no way they'd leave Georgia out in that scenario. Well, maybe not, but their schedule's easy, and if they keep winning games by single digits or 10 scores and they get a loss, likely to a 2-loss SEC West team that won't make the playoff under any circumstances, it's possible. It's totally possible. The playoff committee, as bad of a reputation as it's had in the past, last year they made the most reasonable selections possible. Like Ohio State and TCU, where they were, that was the most reasonable selection. And same thing with, Georgia, Michigan, obviously. And in prior years, I don't know. Wisconsin, for example. Wisconsin got left out behind an 11-1 Alabama in 2017 because Wisconsin had the easier schedule and Alabama looked more impressive throughout the whole year. I have absolute confidence that the same thing would happen with Ohio State over Georgia if Georgia continues to look sluggish. But that's just me. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to see you all around. Expect several videos to be dropped tomorrow. Also, check out the Patreon because I mentioned potential power. And if you want to, get picks, all the resources to make your picks, or maybe you're just going to have fun and make some predictions, Potential Power in a video tomorrow and also some posts on Patreon will provide you with resources to do that. Right now it's 31-17 against the spread over 2 weeks, and it's even better in terms of predicting game outcomes, as in winners or losers. Have a phenomenal day, guys, and I hope